can't remember exactly how long ago, but Greg's been involved with the YCW from back in the 60s in the Adelaide YCW. I'm not sure if it's correct to call you a protege of Len Faulkner, but I know you were very close to Len, Archbishop Len. And Greg also worked as an extension worker up in North Queensland, Cairns, and like John Bonnis, drove a famous Volkswagen all around Australia in his extension work, building up the movement. And after that, Greg moved on into many other things. Studied at university, became a lawyer. And also had a great deal of work with the University of Adelaide, particularly in the fundraising. I remember meeting Greg about 20 years ago when he was international president or chair of the graduate sort of basically the fundraising for universities around the world. Greg did a fantastic job for the University of Adelaide and also for other universities. And he also did a tremendous amount of work in 1991 when we had the World Council of the IYCW in Adelaide. And he helped us raise, maybe Greg can recall how much money that committee raised. It's only a pity that we never continued what we started in 1991. But as Cardijn said, we're always ready to begin again. And today we're beginning again in another way with the Australian Cardijn Institute. And Greg's always been very keen to promote the idea of formation, so he'll speak to us today a bit about formation.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Use these new technologies. I just wanted to first of all say thanks for the invitation. There's 12 of us here. It's a biblical figure, isn't it? And so there's some symbolism in all of that.
It's a biblical, but
what can happen from small groups, we all know, great things. And I come from Adelaide, and we've always looked to Melbourne as the national centre for not just the YCW, but for the lay movements in the church, and the key leader schools that were here, the adult movements, the Catholic worker, the intellectual movements in the church as well. So much of this arose around Melbourne. Melbourne is where the federal parliament sat for its early years, from 1902 to the 1930s. It's where the headquarters of the banks and the unions and all the big decisions were made in the city. And I think that was also true of the church, and probably still is true of the church. So we've always looked to Melbourne as an important focal point and a place for inspiration and leadership and support and sustenance. And that was certainly true in the YCW. I was on the national executive, and probably remember John Alexander, Fred, that was my proxy on the national executive. John died a decade or so ago, but just a couple of weeks ago I spent a morning with Tony, his wife, and their children, and so those friendships just last. I was talking to Brian Lawrence. Those of you might know of Brian, who was the national president of the YCS, and when I went to Townsville and Rockhampton Diocese to work, Gary McDonald, who was the national secretary of the YCW, and Brian and I travelled in my Volkswagen from Melbourne to Townsville. It was a small Beetle. There were 10 boys on the executive of the YCW in Adelaide, the boys executive, and they put in $1 a week and bought me this car. So that's how I got the car. They paid it off for me, and I drove to Townsville twice. It used to take me a week to go from Adelaide to Townsville, and I had a family at each place where I could stay to survive. But Brian sent me a little article about Cardijn, and I thought I'd begin today because we're here because of the influence of Cardijn. And this was written on his anniversary date, which was July the 24th of this year. And it's in a magazine, an article in a magazine called Cru. It's a well-regarded, and this is a very influential magazine. And it said, fans of Vatican-themed intrigue undoubtedly would say that the Belgian cardinal with the greatest direct influence on Pope Francis has to be Godfrey Daniels of Brussels, a member of the so-called St. Gallen group of left-leaning princes of the church, who reportedly tried to block the election of Benedict in 2005, and remnants of which later allegedly helped propel Francis to the papacy. More sober observers, however, probably would insist that the real answer actually is Belgian Cardinal Joseph Leo Cardijn, the famed pioneer of the C. J. Jack method in applying Catholic social teaching. The 51st anniversary of death falls today. The bond between Francis and Cardijn runs in part through Alberto Hurtado, a revered Chilean Jesuit, deeply familiar to the future Pope. Since then, Father Jorge Mario Bergoglio spent a year in 1960 living in the same house of studies outside Santiago, where Hurtado lived and worked for much of his career. Looking back over Catholic history over the last 135 years, since Cardijn's birth in 1882, it's easy to connect the dots between his legacy and the agenda of history's first Argentine Pope. Cardijn was born into a working class family. We all know this so well, don't we? But I'll just recite it. His parents initially were superintendents for a block of apartments, and then his father became a low-level coal merchant while his mother worked at a cafe. Later he'd recall seeing workers file into local factories with their children as young as 7 or 8, working 12 to 14-hour shifts with no rest breaks for a penny a day, with the children often locked in small rooms or tied to workstations so they couldn't wander around the factory floor. The young Cardijn decided he wanted to be a priest, and he happily entered the minor seminary in 1897. When he came home on vacation for the first time, however, he was stunned to find that his former friends gave him a distinctly frosty reception, believing that by joining the church, Cardijn had sided against them. In 1903, when his father died, Cardijn vowed to spend his life serving the working class. By 1925, what would become his young Christian workers' movement was off to a strong yet controversial enough start that he secured an audience with Pope Pius XI, who wrapped it in a warm embrace. Here at least is someone who comes to speak to me about the masses. The greatest scandal of the 19th century was the loss of the workers to the church. The church needs the workers and the workers need the church, the Pope said. Not only do we bless your movement, we make it our own. Pius added, to be sure no one missed the point. Two cornerstones of Cardijn's vision, which would be picked up in Latin America, both through the base communities, those ecclesial communities movement, and in the teaching of the Episcopal Conference of Latin America, that's the equivalent of the Bishops' Conference in Australia, seem to resonate especially well with Francis. The first is his famed C. J. Jack method of discerning pastoral priorities, meaning to look around at the social reality, reach conclusions about what the gospel has to say about it, and then put those conclusions into practice. It's effectively an inductive rather than deductive approach, one that begins not with doctrinal a priori, but clear-eyed observations about what's happening in the concrete here and now. It was ratified explicitly by Pope John XXIII in his 1961 encyclical Mater et Magistra, a document for which the pontiff has asked Cardijn to serve as a primary contributor. We all know of Cardijn's influence in the Vatican Council and then in that important encyclical. For Francis, who constantly warns of the dangers of intellectual rigidity and being cut off from the lives of ordinary people, the appeal is obvious, which is undoubtedly why C. J. Jack is the basic structure of the 2007 Appreciata document of the Latin American bishops, of which then Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio was a primary drafter. The second pillar of Cardijn's thought involves the primacy of the laity in terms of evangelising the working classes. As a young pastor, Cardijn had been assigned to the Royal Parish of Laeken in Brussels, located close to the palace of the King and the Queen. At the time, the area was home to 13,000 underpaid and overstressed factory workers. Cardijn tried to accompany them on the factory floor, but he was dismayed to find signs reading workers only. In a very literal sense, he realised if the gospel was to be brought to the factory, it would have to be workers themselves who did it. That instinct too clearly tracks with the outlook of Francis, who has repeatedly called for greater lay empowerment in Catholicism, especially concerning women. It's great we've got some women here today too. And it's worth noting, by the way, that the original group of workers Cardijn organised were young female needle workers, probably reflecting an intuition that women were especially vulnerable in a male-dominated economy. Despite the fact that Cardijn generated some blowback over the years, certainly plenty of that, with critics accusing him of being a crypto-communist and relativising the faith in favour of some malleable social consensus, he enjoyed strong backing from the popes of his era. And I'll tell you a story about that in a minute. In 1950, for instance, Pope Pius XII named Cardijn a privy chamberlain of His Holiness, allowing him to use the title Monsignor. We remember when he came to Australia, he was Monsignor. In 1965, just 2 years ahead of his death on July the 24th, 1967, Pope Paul VI named Cardijn a cardinal. Granted, one can't draw a straight line between Cardijn's legacy and the papacy of Pope Francis. History is too complicated for that, and there are too many intermediary points along the way between a 20th century Belgian prelate and the 21st century's first pope from the developing world. Still, the Cardijn story is a reminder that neither did Francis fall out of a clear blue sky. More realistically, his papacy can be seen as the confluence of a series of energies and impulses that have been building at Catholicism for more than a century, contested at times, choked back for sure, but also never fully arrested. So that's a pretty important little commentary, I think, of Cardijn and this Pope. And I wanted to talk about this Pope, but I think Stefan might have been in Belgium when there was an international reunion a few years ago. Ron Mayoni with Father Brian Burke was there. He was come from Canada. He was at the stage where he was really affected by his Parkinson's, but he wanted to be there, and he was a speaker at the symposium. But Ron Mayoni was telling a story about Cardijn, who was always early for functions, and he had, as soon as Pope John had been elected, his job was to get down to Rome and make sure he got a mandate for the YCW, because there were plenty of people who were opposed to it, as we know in Australia. So they got down there, and Ron was with him, and he said, look, the Pope's very busy, he's just been elected, he won't see us, we'll get shoved off to some secretary. And they were to meet him at 2 o'clock, and they got down there about 1:15, and Cardijn walked up and down the corridors, and 2 o'clock came, and he said, Rob, we'll go, they're not going to see us. And Rob said, sit down, he'll come. And 2:10, 2:15, 2:20, nearly 2:30, Cardijn was ready to go. And then these footsteps came down, and they said, here comes the secretary to tell us he's not going to see us, and it was the Pope. He came down and he said, Joseph Cardijn. He said, yes, Your Holiness. He said, I've been wanting to meet you. And he embraced him and said, what do you want? What can I do for you? He said, come up. And Cardijn pulled out a list out of his pocket. He said, this is what I want. I want an international chaplain. I want you to support what I'm doing. So you can see why the Pope wanted to have the Vatican, then went on to have the Vatican Council and so on, and wanted to have that influence. And the Church in the modern world, that document in the Vatican Council, was almost a creation of Cardijn and those people who were around him. A very important document. So what I just wanted to say today was just a few words of encouragement for forming this organisation. I think it complements the other Cardijn. You've got the Cardijn community. Kevin and others have been so much involved in. All around Australia, wherever I go, I try and catch up with people, and there are many groups, reunions and friendship groups and so on. I've been in a group in Adelaide for nearly 40 years, and we've had dinner every couple of months. We used to go on a Saturday night and talk through to 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. We now go Sunday afternoons, but we still meet together, and Archbishop Fulton has been part of that group over the years. His bishop's ring was a YSW badge, and which we made for him when he was our chaplain, when he was appointed a bishop. I wanted to emphasise today formation. Each of us are the beneficiaries of formation. We're in a leaders group. We had a relationship with a chaplain. We went through a process that made us people with an exposition of the talents that we never really knew we had. And it brought out something very special in each one of us. And we learned to work with others. You do something yourself, you do it with others, and then you help them to do it in that same way. And there was so much of what we learned that has stayed with us through our lives, and that's why we're here today. That's why we do the things that we've done in our lives. I just wanted to talk for a couple of minutes, the C-section, if you like, the reality of the world that we live in today. And we live in a pretty terrible place, you've got to say. That secular Australia is well and truly with us, and indeed in the first world. It's certainly not in the third world, but it is in the first world. You go to Europe, the churches are empty. The influence of the legislators in formerly such great countries, France, Germany, Belgium, so on, where the church was well established, is now a pale shadow of itself. And similarly in Australia, our church is in crisis in Australia at the moment. And I'm involved in so many of those organisations in the church. But we look globally. What's happening, Brexit, in Trump in America, the attitude of many of those European countries to refugees. We're looking at the internalisation, going back into the shell. Brexit is saying, no, we can do it ourselves. Trump saying, we'll make America great again. We've seen some of that in Australia as well. And just this last week, this horrific speech given, just really feeling that there was authority to talk in such a racist way in our federal parliament. Fortunately, the parties came together to condemn that. But that is a political agenda, and it's to mop up that 10, 15, 20% of the vote, depending on the electorate, but mostly rural electorates, that frightens often poor, forgotten people in our community who are then afraid that the influence of Muslims coming into Australia, the grants for Indigenous communities are all hurting their own families, and others are getting advantages that their children haven't had and they haven't had, and this downward envy and so on and is exploited in this, and racism is one way to do it, and particularly in an anti-religious context as well, in that case anti-Islam. And welcome, Father. But you look at our world today in Australia even, one of the great achievements of the YCW was to help support young workers who were being hurt in the workplace. Poor wages, poor training, there was abuse of young people in the workplace, and so on. And we, through apprenticeship schemes, through regulation, through better acts of Parliament, we were able to protect young workers in many ways, and some of that is still going on. And the YCW today has done great work with the art workers, with young people who are not represented, not advocated. And I must say that the union movement itself has become smaller and smaller, and the union movement in a way is limited in many ways to public sector, ambulances, nurses, teachers, fire personnel and so on, and to the building trades and some other trades. But it's a fraction of the workforce that is now unionised, and the union movement doesn't actually advocate for those who are outside of the movement very well at all. Brian Lawrence, who's represented the views of the church before the National Wage Tribunals now for the last decade or so, has advocated on behalf of those lowest paid workers in the workforce, most of them are non-unionised. And in one of these national wage cases, there was no support at all for that group. All of the arguments were about those actually who were in the unionised workforce. And Brian was saying that in the last two rounds, the National Wage Tribunal has actually now structured the wage on the individual, not on the family. Back in our time, it was the basic wage, what it cost to live for a husband, a wife and 2 kids. That was the structure. We then went to the total wage. I don't know, Barney Williams, wasn't it? He used to come to the key leader schools and talk to us about the wage structures in this country. And so then it went to the total wage, and that was what industry could afford to pay. But now we're at the stage where it's based on the individual. And so the concept of family, the concept of support for children, and so on has been lost from our national wage structure. And you look at the plight of the Indigenous in our community, their health, their education, but their incarceration. You know, the incarceration rates of Indigenous Australians is just appalling. Here we've got a government that is advocating for tax breaks for big corporations, and yet it's cutting the benefits for young unemployed people. And we still don't have those schemes that are seen in many other parts of the world that say to young people, we're not going to pay you to leave school and sit at home, but we want every young person in a youth guarantee to be engaged in work, training or education, or combinations of those. And so you hold people in the mainstream of society until their early 20s at least, and support them rather than isolate them out. And unfortunately, our schools often don't want to have those young people who are less inclined to an academic course of study. They find it hard to fit into the school. Some schools don't even have the equipment, the desks and so on for those students. And the money in education, and I can tell you as a former education minister, that the money in education always goes to those who are the strongest academically. And if you do medicine, we spend 10 times more money on you than if you drop out of school, you know, at 16 or 17. And so there are great challenges that we've got in Australian society. We've seen in this state now the legalisation of euthanasia. Just last week in Belgium, there were 2 children who were euthanased. They both had debilitating disabilities, but neither of them had their lives threatened, but they were able to be legally euthanased. And so the legislation in the federal parliament this week was defeated to allow the territories where it's easy to pass legislation because there's only one house, and so that was stopped. But it is scary to see in a secular world all of these things happening. And what is it that helps people to make a judgment of what's right and what's wrong? Well, we have the advantage of referring back to the Gospels to work out for ourselves and amongst our friends what we thought was right and wrong in those actual situations that we talked about at our meetings when we had a review of life. And that is so powerful and so incredibly important, because if you don't have the God, you don't have a basis on which to make those decisions, then it's just what you bring yourself. And you see that as people. Is it money? Is it materialism? Is it power? What is it that makes and motivates people to do that? I was visiting a parish in Mackay when I was working for the YSW. The girls, a full-time worker, Veronica Corcoran was with me, and it was an old Irish parish priest, and we went and saw him and said, look, Father, we work for the YSW, we've come to meet the young people in your parish, and we want them to join a leaders group, and we were to get the YSW going. And he said, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Adelaide. And that was the first mistake, of course, I made down south. And he said to Veronica and I, he said, look, before you could work in my parish, I'd like to give you a test, an examination. We said, sure, what do you want to know? He said, I want you to recite the 10 Commandments. And we said, well, I think between us we could probably work that out. We could scratch up the 10 Commandments, but what does that tell you about us that is going to help you to make that decision? And he said, well, what do you mean? And we said, look, we have come to talk to young people, and we want them to be inspired by the Gospels and to learn how to work out for their own lives where they want to go, but having a set of parameters, a set of values that come from the Gospels that will inspire us. And he said, "Are you sure you're not Protestants?" And so we eventually talked him into letting us into the parish. But we went back to Rockhampton and we saw Bishop Rush, who at that stage was the bishop's deputy for the YCW. He was a famous bishop. And we told him the story, and he said, "Look, I'm going up to Mackay in a couple of weeks and you'll both come with me." And so we went up, and I had my car up there, my Volkswagen. We got him in the back, the bishop drove him around to various parishes, but we went to this one, and he said to the parish priest, "Look, you got my message?" And the priest said, "Yeah." And he said, "You've organised a meeting, haven't you, of all the young people in the parish tonight?" "Yes." "Now, Greg and Veronica, they're going to speak to young people tonight, and I want you to support them and be there, you know, and they've got something important to do in this diocese and in your parish." And so the bishop came and the priest came, and we had about 70 or 80 young people came to the meeting in the parish, and we didn't look back after that. We got 16 groups of the YSW going in Rockhampton itself, and right throughout that incredible remote diocese. You go out to Longreach and Barcall and all those places, the same in Townsville diocese, and the government gave us rail passes so that we could go on the train. We'd go on the train, catch the train out to Mount Isa, and stay 2 or 3 days in each parish, and mostly older Irish priests. And one parish I was in, 2 days I'd been there playing cards with the parish priest, having a whiskey or two, and saying, "Father, I need to talk to the young people. I need to tomorrow, you know." And they were just so lonely. Many of them weren't well. They'd been left in their parishes for far too long and not supported. It was a tough existence. There wasn't one parish in Townsville diocese, apart from those on the coast, that had hot water in their presbyteries. And it was this filthy, stinking bore water that came. It was hot in itself in the hot weather, but you know, that was the lot of those priests who had come from Ireland. They'd lost contact with their families at home, and they hadn't really made the friendships here. And I think it was almost every priest in that diocese was a volunteer. So that's the sea, isn't it? That's the world that we're faced. And this is what Pope Francis has said in The Joy of the Gospels. He's written these wonderful, wonderful exhortations. And people are very critical of this Pope, and it's a good thing in a way that he's caused debate. And Laudato Si, which is about the environment, was the one that the Americans just went spare about, because he attacked capitalism in it. He attacked greed. He attacked the Me Tooism that is so often part of that ideology or philosophy. And this is what he said about lay people. And our church, if it's going to have a future, and we will hope it does, it's going to be around lay people, and it's going to be around lay people that have engaged in deep formation, that really have a confidence and a hopeful aura about them, and who not just want to work to see the church survive into the future, but want to transform society as well. And that's what the YSW was always about. It was taking us out in the community, giving us the skills, whether it was to speak publicly, to chair meetings, to write minutes, to go out there and do things in the community that were constructive. So this is what the Pope said. Lay people are, put simply, the vast majority of the people of God. The minority, ordained ministers, are at their service. And you have to say that it's been the other way around in many, many places. And that's known as clericalism. And he talks about that as well. There has been a growing awareness, in contrast to the YSW, where we saw so many priests and religious who were selfless, you know, who really did have a commitment to the laity and to their formation and their role in the church. There has been a growing awareness of the identity and mission of the laity in the church. We can count on many laypersons, although still not nearly enough, who have a deeply rooted sense of community and great fidelity to the tasks of charity, catechesis and celebration of faith. At the same time, a clear awareness of this responsibility of the laity, grounded in their baptism and confirmation, does not appear in the same way in all places. In some cases, it's because laypersons have not been given the formation needed to take on important responsibilities. In others, it is because in their particular churches room has not been made for them